My husband struck me across the face in front of his mother. I thought she would defend him, make excuses, tell me I deserved it. Instead, she dialed 911 and brought his entire world crumbling down around him. For 5 years, I had been walking on broken glass around Marcus Chen. The violence started small. You know how it always does. A shove here when dinner wasn't ready on time. A grab of my wrist when I questioned his decisions. A raised voice that made me flinch even before his hand connected with my skin. Always behind locked doors, always followed by tears, his tears, and promises that dripped like honey from his lips, sweet and sticky and ultimately meaningless. This weekend, his mother had come to visit, and I had been killing myself trying to be the perfect daughter-in-law, the perfect wife, the perfect everything. Victoria Morrison was everything I could never be. Polished like expensive silverware, educated at schools I couldn't even dream of affording, and descended from one of those families whose names were carved into buildings downtown. She made it crystal clear from our very first meeting that I wasn't remotely good enough for her precious son. The girl from the sketchy apartments who got knocked up and trapped her golden boy into a shotgun wedding, even though we lost that baby 3 months after we said our vows. Victoria had this talent, this gift really, for making me feel 2 inches tall without ever saying anything you could actually call cruel. She'd run her perfectly manicured fingers along windowsills, checking for dust. She'd suggest better brands of cleaning supplies with this tone that said everything about what she thought of my housekeeping. Oh, and Marcus's ex-girlfriend, Rebecca, apparently she was such an amazing cook, came from such a lovely family, had such impeccable taste in everything. Every single conversation felt like a pop quiz I hadn't studied for. Every interaction was a reminder that I would never, ever measure up to her standards. So I spent that entire weekend cooking her favorite meals. Finger sandwiches with the crusts carefully removed, the kind you see in old movies about rich people. Tea served at exactly 185 degrees, not a degree cooler or warmer. Beef tenderloin that took me 7 hours to prepare because I kept checking and rechecking the recipe, terrified I'd mess it up. I cleaned our house until my hands were raw and cracked. I vacuumed carpets that were already spotless. I organized closets that didn't need organizing. I polished mirrors until they gleamed like water. And through it all, I smiled and nodded while she criticized everything, from the way I folded the guest towels to the outfit I chose for dinner, to the flowers I'd arranged in her room, which apparently were the wrong variety for the season. She had this way of looking at me, like I was a stain on her expensive furniture, something unpleasant that needed to be dealt with but was too distasteful to address directly. Her disapproval filled every room she entered, thick and suffocating like smoke. The explosion happened over something ridiculous, because it always does, doesn't it? I had accidentally used the fine china for our afternoon lunch instead of saving it for the evening dinner party. It was an honest mistake, I swear. My hands were shaking so badly as I set the table, so desperate to impress her, that I grabbed the wrong plates from the cabinet. Marcus's grandmother's Wedgwood china, the set with the delicate hand-painted roses. Each piece was worth more than I made in 2 weeks at the bookstore where I worked part-time, barely enough hours to call it employment. Marcus's face went from normal to crimson the second he saw those plates, and that vein in his temple started pulsing, the one that always appeared right before things got bad. Really bad. "What is wrong with you?" he hissed at me, his voice low and dangerous in that way that made my stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables. "I specifically told you those were for tonight, when the Harrisons are coming over. Those plates are worth more than your pathetic paycheck." "I'm sorry," I stammered, reaching to clear the table, my hands trembling so hard the china rattled. I'll wash them right now and reset everything with the everyday dishes. I promise I'll be more careful. I'll pay more attention. I'll do better." His mother sat right there at the head of the table, sipping her Earl Grey from one of those precious cups, like absolutely nothing was happening. Her lipstick, perfect, not a smudge on the rim. I thought, maybe, just maybe, her presence would keep him in check. Perhaps he wouldn't dare show his true face in front of the woman whose opinion mattered more to him than anything else in this world. More than my safety, more than our marriage, more than basic human decency. I have never been more wrong about anything in my entire life. Marcus grabbed my wrist so hard I felt the bones grinding together, his fingers wrapping completely around my arm like a handcuff made of flesh. "You never listen, do you? You're too stupid to follow simple instructions. How many times do I have to explain things before they penetrate that thick skull of yours? How many times do I have to spell everything out like you're a child?" The familiar panic rose in my chest like floodwater, drowning me from the inside. This was always how it started, you see. Words designed to make me feel worthless and small and stupid. A grip that would leave purple and yellow fingerprints for days that I'd have to hide under long sleeves in summer. And that look in his eyes that said everything wrong in his life was somehow my fault, my responsibility to fix. I tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened, and tears sprang to my eyes from the pain shooting up my arm. "Please," I whispered, my voice barely audible, glancing at his mother with what I knew was pathetic hope written all over my face. "You're hurting me." His mother continued sipping her tea, her face as blank as a wall, as if she was watching some mildly interesting program on television that didn't quite hold her attention. There would be no help from that direction. She probably blamed me for embarrassing her son, for creating drama during her visit, for being the kind of woman who provoked men into violence through sheer incompetence. That's when he did it. Right there in front of his mother, in the middle of our dining room with its crystal chandelier and mahogany table that had been in his family for 4 generations. He pulled his hand back and slapped me across the face so hard that my ears rang like church bells, and I tasted copper blood in my mouth. The impact sent me stumbling backward into the antique sideboard, my hip connecting with its sharp corner in a burst of white-hot pain. A crystal vase filled with roses wobbled dangerously, and I caught it with my free hand, because God forbid I break something else valuable while being assaulted. I stood there in shock, my cheek burning like someone had pressed a hot iron against my skin, waiting for his mother to gasp, to object, to do something, anything. She'd always been so obsessed with appearances, with propriety, with maintaining the family's reputation in our small town where everyone knew everyone's business and gossiped about everything. Surely domestic violence in her precious dining room would cross some line, if only because it looked bad. Instead, she set her teacup down with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and she looked directly at her son. "Marcus David Chen," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade through silk. "What did you just do?" Something in her tone made Marcus freeze completely, his hand still raised from the slap, hanging in the air like a grotesque statue. This wasn't the voice of a shocked mother-in-law. It wasn't surprise or horror or dismay. It was something entirely different, carrying the weight of absolute authority and years of accumulated knowledge about exactly what kind of man her son really was. The same tone that had probably terrified him as a child when he'd broken something expensive or tracked mud through her spotless house. The voice of consequences approaching like a storm on the horizon. He stammered, trying to form words, trying to construct some excuse, but she held up one perfectly manicured finger. The gesture was small but powerful, like a conductor demanding absolute silence from an orchestra. "I asked you a question," she said, her tone completely calm, which somehow made it more terrifying. "What did you just do to your wife?" Marcus's face went white, then red, then white again, like someone was adjusting the color settings on a screen. I could see him scrambling for an explanation, some way to minimize what had just happened, some way to blame it on me like he always did, some way to convince his mother that I deserved it, that any reasonable man would have done the same thing in his position. "She was being disrespectful," he said quietly, his voice actually shaking. "She needs to learn to follow instructions. You know how careless she is with expensive things, Mom. She never thinks before she acts. She's always breaking something or making some stupid mistake that costs us money." His mother stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that cracked through the room like a gunshot in a library. She was a small woman, maybe 5'3" in her sensible heels, but somehow she seemed to fill the entire space with her presence. The expression on her face was something I'd never seen before in the 5 years I'd known her, and I'd seen her disappointed, annoyed, condescending, critical, but never this. It wasn't anger exactly, but something colder and more frightening. Something calculated and predatory that made Marcus actually take a step backward until he hit the wall behind him like a cornered animal with nowhere left to run. "Sit down," she said. And Marcus actually obeyed, sliding into his chair like a scolded child, his mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out, like a fish drowning in air. Victoria walked over to me with measured steps, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision, and I actually thought she was going to slap me too. Finish what her son had started. Tell me I deserved it for being careless with her family's precious china, for embarrassing her son in front of her, for being the kind of woman who drove men to violence through her own inadequacy. Instead, she gently took my chin in her hand and tilted my face toward the light streaming through the window. Her touch was surprisingly tender, like she was examining a piece of damaged art that might be salvageable with the right care. The red handprint was already darkening to purple, and my lip had split where my teeth cut the inside of my mouth. "How long?" she asked quietly, her eyes never leaving my injured face, studying every mark, every shadow, every trace of pain. "I don't understand," I mumbled, confused by her sudden concern, by the way she was looking at me like she actually cared what happened to me. "How long has my son been hitting you?" The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating, and I could feel Marcus's eyes boring into me from across the room, silently threatening what would happen later if I told the truth. The familiar fear crept up my spine like ice water, the fear that had kept me silent for 5 years, the fear that had convinced me this was somehow normal, somehow my fault, somehow something I had to endure because I'd made vows. "I'm not. I mean, he doesn't. This was just..." I tripped over the words, the lies coming automatically after years of practice, years of covering bruises with makeup and explaining away injuries with increasingly creative stories. "Don't lie to me," she said quietly, but there was steel underneath the softness. "I've been watching you for 5 years. I know what fear looks like on a woman's face. I know what careful movements look like, what forced smiles look like, what it means when someone flinches every time a door slams or a voice is raised unexpectedly." She turned to Marcus, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "5 years ago, you came back from your honeymoon with a black eye. You said you walked into a door on the sunset cruise, hit your face on a low beam when the boat rocked. I knew you were lying then, but I thought she had hit you. I was almost relieved, thinking you'd married someone strong enough to fight back, someone who wouldn't take your abuse quietly. Marcus's jaw dropped open, his expression cycling through shock, denial, and growing panic. "Mom, I raised you better than this," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I raised you to protect women, not terrorize them. I raised you to be a man of honor, not a coward who uses his size to intimidate someone smaller and weaker. Your father may have been difficult in many ways, but he never laid a hand on me or you children in anger. He had his faults, God knows he had plenty of them, but he wasn't a coward." That wasn't entirely true, and we all knew it. I'd heard whispered stories from Marcus's walls during arguments about their father's rages, the holes punched in walls, the way their mother would wear long sleeves in summer, and makeup that was just a little too heavy around her eyes after particularly bad fights. But apparently, Victoria had decided to rewrite that history. Or maybe she'd convinced herself that emotional abuse and intimidation didn't count as real violence, that it was somehow different, somehow less damaging. She walked to her purse, an expensive leather bag that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and pulled out her phone. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, genuine terror creeping into his voice for the first time since I'd known him. His face had gone absolutely white, and I could see a vein throbbing rapidly in his temple, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm calling your sister Hannah first, and then I'm calling the police." The room went deadly silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the sound of my own heartbeat pounding so loudly, I was certain everyone could hear it echoing off the walls. Even the birds outside seemed to have stopped singing, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Marcus jumped up so fast his chair tipped over backward and crashed to the floor with the sound like breaking bones. "You can't do that," he snarled, his voice rising to a pitch I'd never heard before. "This is between me and my wife. It's none of your business what happens in my marriage. You have no right to interfere in our private affairs, no right to stick your nose where it doesn't belong." Victoria looked at him with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something scraped off the bottom of a shoe. "Everything you do is my business when you're doing it wrong. I didn't spend 40 years building this family's reputation in this community, serving on charity boards and hosting fundraisers and being a pillar of society to have you destroy it all by beating your wife like some common criminal from the projects." I understood then that she wasn't defending me out of compassion or moral outrage or some noble desire to protect the innocent. She was protecting the family name, the carefully cultivated image of respectability that came with being Morrisons in this town where reputation was currency and scandal was bankruptcy. But for the first time in 5 years, someone was standing between me and Marcus's fists, and I didn't care what her motivations were, as long as she kept doing it, as long as she kept being that shield I so desperately needed. The next few hours passed in a blur of flashing lights and official questions. Police cruisers parked in front of our house while neighbors gathered on their perfect lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. Statements given in separate rooms while officers took notes and detectives asked questions that peeled back layers of lies I'd been telling for years. How often did he hurt you? Did he ever threaten your life? Were you ever afraid he might kill you? Did he control your money, your phone, your contact with friends and family? The answers revealed a pattern of systematic abuse that had been invisible to everyone except Victoria's private investigator. Yes, he controlled all our finances. Yes, he'd convinced me to stop seeing friends who questioned our relationship. Yes, he checked my phone and email daily. And yes, I was terrified he might actually kill me during his worst rages, when his eyes went dead and his hands found my throat. Victoria held my hand through all of it, never showing emotion except a slight tightening around her eyes when the detective described what the medical examiner would photograph during my examination. Her fingers were cool and steady, anchoring me to reality when everything else felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Marcus was arrested and led away in handcuffs while neighbors whispered and pointed. The golden boy of the country club sat reduced to shouting threats from the back of a police car while his mother watched with cold satisfaction etched into every line of her face. Later, sitting in Victoria's immaculate living room with its cream furniture and carefully arranged flowers, I finally asked the question that had been eating at me. Why now? If you knew what was happening, if you'd been documenting it, why didn't you help me sooner? Why did you let me suffer for years while you collected evidence? Victoria was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at her perfectly manicured garden. Then she reached into an old jewelry box and pulled out a photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The photo showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from genuine happiness and hope for the future. She wore a wedding dress that must have been beautiful 40 years ago, all lace and innocence and dreams. "This is my sister, Charlotte Morrison," Victoria said softly, her voice vulnerable in a way I'd never heard. She died when she was 27. Her husband beat her to death with a tire iron in their garage while their 3 children slept upstairs, completely unaware their mother was dying just below them. I had no idea Marcus had an aunt, no idea that Victoria carried this kind of pain, this kind of history that explained everything about her behavior. I was supposed to be her maid of honor, Victoria continued. Instead, I carried her casket at her funeral 7 years later. I swore that day, standing beside her grave in the pouring rain, that I would never let another woman in my family suffer what she suffered, that I would never again fail to act when I saw the warning signs written so clearly. "But you treated me terribly," I said, still trying to understand. "You made me feel worthless for 5 years, like I could never measure up, like I wasn't good enough for your family." Victoria sighed, and for the first time she looked every one of her 68 years. "I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how," she said. "I thought if I could make you leave on your own, if I could make you see this family wasn't right for you, you'd be safer than if I intervened directly. When that didn't work, when I realized you were just like Charlotte, too loyal, too hopeful, too willing to believe love could fix everything broken, I knew I had to take a different approach." She pulled out another folder, this one even thicker, filled with legal documents and evidence. I needed enough proof to guarantee Marcus would go to prison, not just get a slap on the wrist and court-ordered therapy that wouldn't change anything fundamental about who he was. I needed documentation that would hold up in court, that would convince a judge to keep him away from you permanently, that would survive the best lawyers his father's money could buy. The evidence was staggering in its thoroughness and attention to detail. 5 years of meticulous documentation from multiple sources, creating an airtight case that no defense attorney could dismantle. Hospital records, police reports from wellness checks filed by concerned neighbors, testimony from people who'd witnessed Marcus's controlling behavior in public, audio recordings of our worst fights that I never knew existed. I had to be absolutely certain, Victoria continued, her voice weighted with her sister's memory. One chance to get him convicted and imprisoned where he couldn't hurt you anymore. If I'd acted too soon with insufficient evidence, he would have learned to be more careful, would have isolated you completely, moved you away from anyone who might help, and the next time might have been the last time, the final beating that killed you. Victoria paid for the best attorney money could buy, a woman who specialized in domestic violence cases and had a perfect record of protecting her clients. The divorce took 11 months, played out in courtrooms across the county. Marcus tried to fight everything, hiring expensive lawyers to paint me as a gold digger who had trapped him and then systematically destroyed his life through my incompetence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, the medical records, the testimony, the audio recordings of Marcus threatening to kill me if I ever tried to leave. He got 7 years in prison for aggravated domestic assault, with possibility of parole after 5 if he completed intensive counseling. I got the house, substantial alimony, and a restraining order that would follow him for the rest of his life. Victoria and I never became close in the traditional sense, but we developed something deeper. A relationship built on mutual respect and shared trauma and understanding. She helped me find work at her foundation, helping other women rebuild their lives after escaping abuse. I helped her process 40 years of guilt over Charlotte's death.